All right, hello, and everybody, welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, which is a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. Just a quick reminder here that the deadline for Pop Conference proposals has been extended to November 22nd, which is Friday. So if you were in a state of stunned disbelief last week, you still have a chance to do that now. Um, I'm Carl Wilson, one of this season's series organizers, along with Elena Razlogova, Gus Stadler, Alex Vizi, and Eric Weisbart. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal tab, and you can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including our most recent celebrating the How Women Make Music anthology, edited by Alison Fensterstock and featuring a bunch of the contributors. Our next event will be at the same time on December 3rd, when Stephen Dusner and Stacey Easton will be here to talk about their respective new 33 and a third books, Garth Brooks in the Life of Chris Gaines and Dolly Parton's White Limousine. Today, though, we are excited to have Brian Kane here to talk about his work, Hearing Double, Jazz Ontology, Auditory Culture, on Oxford University Press, in conversation with Daphne Brooks, with whom Brian is a co-director of Yale University's Working Group on Black Sound and the Archive. Now, let me just give you some additional background on today's presenters. Brian Kane is an associate professor in the music department at Yale, whose research explores the intertwining of traditional music disciplines, such as music theory and musicology, with sound studies, philosophy, media studies, and contemporary sonic practices. His previous book was Sound Unseen, Acousmatic Sound in Theory and Practice, which came from Oxford in 2014. He's published in a wide range of journals and is also a founding editor of nonsite.org, an online open source journal of politics, art, and the humanities. His current book project is a quote, pointed intervention in voice studies, which maybe we can ask him about later. And Daphne A. Brooks is the author of three books: Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances of Race and Freedom, 1850 to 1910, Jeff Buckley's Grace, and Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound, the winner of 11 book awards and prizes. She is currently at work on two new books, Rhapsody in Ruin, Porgy and Bess and the Story of America, and I Am the Genre, Beyonce, Black Feminist Genius, and the Breaking of Form, both of which are forthcoming from FSG, so we surely haven't seen the last of her at PMBiP. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat, and in the last part of the session, Gus Stadler will call on you to unmute and ask them during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation, while we'll ask the presenters to ignore the chat during their discussion. And now, please take it away, Brian and Daphne.
Thank you so much, Carl Wilson. Such an inspiration in so many ways. Brian Kane, it is great to be here in this space with you to
Right.
talk about this truly luminous book that is, I would say, in some ways, for Brian Kane fans, which I'm one of many, it's a little bit of a point of a departure for you in your work, I would say, stylistically, your voice in this book. So I do want to talk about that and many other things with you. But
Mhm.
first, I just want to congratulate you and thank you for this book. It's actually, this might sound weird, but it's a little bit, it's comforting to read this book right now, to go back to it. I've read different portions of it before as you were working on it. But to actually return to it now in this time of precarity and uncertainty. I think I was joking a little bit before we started this event, but I do truly mean it when I say that you're giving us a way to pedagogically think about renewal and possibility and transfiguration in collective spaces. And we need that more than ever. And jazz has been the radical sonic space for us to do that for over 100 years now. So thank you, Professor Kane. Um, we're going to start off with you sharing a little bit from the work itself.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Daphne. I mean, as people know, mean, Daphne is my dear colleague here at Yale, and we're co-collaborators and conspirators in the Black Sound on the Archive working group. So it's really and Daphne's always the person who I want to have a conversation with about this material. I mean, I think for so many of us here, she's a kind of wonderful, what's the Greek term, the daimon, the kind of spirit, right, who's in our head, right? And so it's been, whoops, what happened there on my screen? So it's been really I'm really looking forward to getting to talk about the book with you. I thought that I would just read a little bit from the introduction of the book, because it sort of gives an overview of what I'm trying to do in the book in a kind of very general way. And I think it's also kind of personal. It sets up, I mean, this is a book that is really rooted a lot in my own experience as a jazz musician. It's a book that's had a very long gestation period. The ideas in it, in some ways, have been with me since my 20s, my early 20s, and have just taken a long time to come to fruition. So I thought that this might be the best way into it, and then have a conversation. I'm excited to hear the questions, and there's wonderful familiar faces here. I'm very excited. I'll read a little bit from the introduction, which is called Why Standards. When jazz musicians get together to play, their repertory often consists of standards, well-known songs like Stella by Starlight, All the Things You Are, or Body and Soul. And for the young jazz musician, it can be a challenge to learn this repertory because there are no definitive sources by which to acquire it. To learn the jazz repertory requires much more than just the acquisition of a few fake books. It demands a lot of listening, tracking down the famous recorded performances of these tunes, and getting a sense of the typical ways that these songs have been played. Many jazz musicians work closely with recordings, transcribing harmonies or solos note by note, and in doing so, acquiring knowledge of how those in the past have played these tunes. Musicians teach songs to one another, and over time, the neophyte comes to get a grip on the repertory. My own attempt to get a grip on the jazz repertory began in the years when I worked in San Francisco and Oakland as a jazz guitarist from about the 1990s until the mid 2000s. Now, I was thankfully gifted with a good ear for harmony, so I could hear a chord progression once or twice and follow its basic moves, and that was a very useful skill to have. For a while, I worked at the house band at a regular Sunday afternoon jam session at the Birdcage on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, and the leader of that band was a trumpeter named Robert Porter, who was an institution in the Oakland jazz scene. Porter, small in stature but big in personality, would always show up in a three-piece suit with his vest buttoned tight. During the jam sessions, he would watch over the happenings from a spot at the side of the bandstand. You could gauge his opinions of the music being made by watching the features on his smooth, brown, bald head. The repertory played at the Birdcage was associated with bebop and hard bop. Oakland, just across the bay from San Francisco, was a magnet for African American migration in the years around World War II. And like many predominantly black cities, Oakland had many clubs and venues where you could hear neighborhood music, jazz, soul, funk, and R&B. On a Sunday at the Birdcage, you would have likely heard songs like Out of Nowhere, Star Eyes, On Green Dolphin Street, a handful of Charlie Parker heads, Round Midnight, Horace Silver's tunes like Nika's Dream or Doodlin, Watermelon Man, or Invitation. Porter understood that the Sunday session was an informal classroom where young musicians would come to learn how to play the music. And he was always open to us college kids, wryly incredulous that we wanted to learn to play jazz, even as he would point us in the right direction. On a couple of occasions, I visited him in his one-bedroom apartment in downtown Oakland. The apartment had a small kitchen and a very large record collection. He would heat up a saucepan of okra or beans and pull records off the shelf and onto the turntable. Sometimes he would trace the influences or genealogies of some musician's style, but more often than not, he'd simply tell me, "You got to hear this," or "If you don't know this recording, then you don't know shit." In Oakland, the jazz repertory functioned as a common coin, one that allowed for the musicians to play together on the bandstand. And once you had a grip on it, you could go almost anywhere and make music with any of the musicians on the scene. Knowledge of the repertory was a way of entering into the social and cultural world of Oakland's Black community. If you could survive on the bandstand, after the gig, you would likely end up at a table at Mrs. Kelly's restaurant, eating red beans and rice and talking with the musicians. You learn about their upbringing and their education in the music, about the musicians that they grew up with or worked with in the past, and about all the clubs that were no longer around. Although the repertory wasn't absolutely specific to Oakland, there was a sense that these musicians had been playing these well-worn tunes for a long, long time. The repertoire was incorporated both into their shared history and their everyday interactions. These songs were just part of the local culture, like long-standing inside jokes or nicknames, all things that help facilitate a sense of belonging together. The house band at the Birdcage started doing a Monday night jam session at the Café du Nord on Market Street in San Francisco, and Porter would lead the band. In a typical style, he would bring people up to play. One night, I recall him clearing his throat into the microphone and telling the audience, "We've got a real legend in the house tonight, Mr. Frank Jackson. Frank is going to come up and play a song, so you better shut up and listen." Frank was a pianist and a singer, originally from Texas, who had come to California after enlisting in the military as part of that migration to the West Coast in the years around World War II. And during the heyday of San Francisco's Fillmore district, Frank had been one of the scene's bedrock musicians. He worked in house bands in various clubs, backing up traveling musicians from the likes of Ben Webster to Slim Gaillard to Sarah Vaughan. He played jam sessions at Jimbo's Bop City. He worked breakfast joints from early in the morning until noontime. He played on cramped bandstands behind go-go dancers and at hotel lounges, singing the standards. After Porter's introduction, Frank came up to the stage, sat down at the piano, and called out the tune Route 66. Without even counting it off, he launched into an introduction at the piano that reminded me of the famous Nat Cole recording. And as the song went on, I could hear him quoting more and more of that recording. And when it came time for the ending, since I knew that record well, I could anticipate where he was going. I played all the riffs and hits with him as if we had practiced it, and that cemented our musical relationship. I ended up working with him for over a decade in a small trio of piano, guitar, and bass, and that trio was my masterclass in the jazz repertoire. I was in my late 20s, and Frank was an octogenarian, but his youthful voice and wrinkle-free face seemed incongruent with his age. He didn't read music very well, and he didn't need to. He had a near photographic memory for popular songs and an ear that would allow him to harmonize at the keyboard whatever he heard in his head. He was a favorite performer of fans of the Great American Songbook. On a regular Monday night gig in Palo Alto, Frank would take requests from the audience, and I would wait, not without a small touch of terror, to discover what song I would be playing momentarily that I had never heard of before. Frank's repertoire was different from what was played at the Oakland Jam Sessions. He was like an embodied archive of popular music from the 1930s and 40s. Aside from all the Gershwin, Berlin, Rodgers and Hart, and Cole Porter songs that one might expect, Frank's true inspiration was Nat King Cole. Now, not the later incarnation, the celebrated pop vocalist in front of orchestras and big bands, but the young piano-playing leader of the King Cole trio. He knew everything in the Nat Cole catalog: classics, the humorous songs, the obscure songs, and many, many overlooked ballads. He knew songs associated from long-forgotten movies, old hit parade favorites, and even commercial jingles from his youth. But he also transformed them through his own musical sensibilities. As all jazz musicians do, Frank had his own habits of harmonization, his collection of vamps and endings and introductions that might be deployed as needed, and his ways of building drama through form, dynamics, and vocal tonal coloring. In Frank's hands, the jazz repertoire was more than a shared social coin within the jazz community, an object that would facilitate musicians to get a jam session going. He knew the history of these songs, their original context, and the way that they had circulated. He could recall when he had first heard them, which versions of the tunes he liked and disliked, and how the songs had, through use, acquired new chord changes, additional verses, or unique introductions and vamps. Through working with him, I came to realize that the social dimension of the jazz repertoire was supplemented with an historical dimension. Not only did these songs facilitate performance, but each performance was inscribed within a horizon of past performances. And those two dimensions, the social and the historical, if I can call them such, were not simply orthogonal, defining a social and historical grid on which to map the jazz repertoire, but they were also intertwined. Frank's re-performances of the past were not historicist in nature, but they were archives of the sedimentation of previous forms of sociality, of ways that the music had circulated in the past. And at the same time, the sociality central to the Oakland scene's use of the repertoire was itself historically rooted. Its forms of sociality had been shaped through the experiences that the musicians in that scene had shared. The standards that formed the center of the jazz repertoire could not be mapped onto a simple grid because they were not fixed entities. A standard is not just a song, a composition, or a set of chords with a melody, something simple and easy to conceptualize, but something else entirely, a changing thing that is irreducible to any one of its performances, even as it is shaped through its performances. And unlike the traditional notion of the musical work, standards are not fixed entities. Their mode of being is not reducible to something notated, scored, published, recorded, and then reperformed again and again. Standards are protean. They are musical entities that differ over time, that slide into the contours of diverse social situations, and that accrue and shed musical properties and musical meanings through transformative cycles of performance and reperformance. And yet, for all of their malleability, standards have a palpability that is indisputable. These songs are called in the bandstand every day, at almost every gig and jam session. They are shared across communities of musicians. They are loved or hated by listeners. They trigger memories for some and are forcefully memorized by others. Standards, protean as they are, have solidity and reality because they have stakes. If you are a jazz musician and you do not know the standard being called, you might be ashamed or embarrassed or outclassed or lose the gig. But if you do know it, you might find entrance into a community that had seemed inaccessible or performance opportunities that could be garnered in no other way. Knowing standards mattered. If not your life, then your livelihood might depend on it. So, to articulate what is so singular and so odd about standards and why they're a worthy object of patient inquiry, we must differentiate a standard from a song. A song might get played and replayed quite a lot, but for a song to become a standard requires not only that it be treated in multiple performances by multiple performers, but that it also has become familiar in the jazz tradition to do so. A tune played only once could not be regarded as a standard, nor could a musician intend to produce a standard by playing a single tune repeatedly. Because standards are widely interpreted, different performances diverge greatly from one another in terms of their musical aspects, tempo, harmony, melody, form, and the like. Moreover, it's precisely those divergences that are valued and cultivated by both performers and listeners. By comparing different performances of the same standard, one is invited to compare and evaluate qualities of virtuosity or originality. Standards, while part of the jazz canon, have no canonic form. They do not evoke a single past performance or fixed aural image. Rather, they are built upon a basis of multiple performances, each differing in degrees from the others. To fix this idea in our minds, a standard might be depicted as a network, one in which the nodes represent distinct performances, and in which node-to-node relations or edges represent similarities and differences among performances. And yet, a standard is not any particular node in this network, but a permissive set of protocols, rules, strategies, and customs that emerge from the network in its holism. At the very least, that is my intuition. And it's been an abiding one that has shaped my own transition from a jazz musician into a jazz scholar. And this book is an attempt to transform that intuition into a theory.
Come on. I love it so much. I'm going to ask you it's not frivolous, it's just a personal question for myself right now. Where is that club in Palo Alto? You know, I'm from Palo Alto.
Yeah. So
No, I
this
lied.
was
Berkeley.
okay. Yeah. So this was a restaurant called
Keystone?
what's
No.
that?
But no, go ahead. Where is it?
It was a restaurant called Madalena's. I think it was on Emerson Street.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So over in that part of Palo Alto.
Okay, yeah, that part of Palo Alto. It's an amazing story about Frank and about a larger communal scene in which you were learning and participating and growing as both a thinker and a practitioner of the music. I have so many questions for you, but I think maybe for those who are on the call and being introduced to this work for the first time, it might be helpful to contextualize the stakes of your argument. So in the book, argument is it's a story
Yeah.
you're telling. It's an argument of story you're telling. But there is an interlocutor that you're or multiple interlocutors, I would say, that you're pushing back on in this book, especially in the context of musicological ontology
Mhm.
studies. You want to call it
Yeah.
that? And so
Sure.
maybe you could give folks a sense of what that is
Yeah.
and what the claims are and how the social and the historical in particular push back against and complicate some of those claims.
Yeah. Well, So I think it's important to know that by ontology here, I'm using the term in the way that philosophers of music and musicologists tend to use the term, which is ontology is describing something like what a musical work is, right? So people who tend to write about the ontology of music are writing what about the musical work. And in kind of standard musicological discourse, um, we might think of a musical work as being like, the paradigm example is always Beethoven's Fifth or something like this, right? So a score that is used so a musical work is not reducible to a score or a performance, but it's the kind of thing that inhabits both of those. Like a musical work is somehow instantiated in a score and in its performances. And philosophers and musicologists, have kind of challenged the notion of the musical work for a long time. I'm just in that tradition. There's lots of people who have done it. I think that one of the things that I try to do in the book is to argue um, that the idea of a musical work is still relevant in the jazz world. Like jazz musicians play songs, right? And they know what song they are playing, even as they do it in very different ways. So I didn't want to get rid of the notion of the musical work. People have tried to do that. What I was trying to do was to actually make an argument that musical works change, that they are corrigible, as I call them in the book. So rather than normally we tend to think about musical books as being immutable somehow. They are like the composer makes them or they are discovered or whatever, and then they just participate, they are embodied in scores and performances. I was really interested in the way that musical works could change because it seemed to me that if you limited yourself to thinking about, or not limited yourself, if you really thought deeply about the jazz standard and how it was shaped up over time, you were going to find moments where these tunes were changing, where new chords were introduced, new melodies were introduced. People excised melody, like the permissive protocols of jazz were constantly working on these musical works, and that was something that I wanted to try to theorize. I think that other people like Georgina Bourne, for instance, has kind of laid out a model for some of this. But what I was trying to do in the book, at least in the first half of the book, was make a very analytic and patient and clear argument about how this happens. How could a musical work change over time? And so I tried to lay out a set of protocols and ways of thinking about what's happening on the bandstand and how chord substitution works and all of these kind of imminent musical uh, things that jazz musicians do, very simple operations like, changing chords, changing melodies, all that stuff that happens all the time. I was trying to squeeze some philosophical juice out of those things. And so that's kind of like one set of interlocutors for the first half of the book.
Yes, yes. Well, can I ask you where, and you know these characters well, we both do, but where folks like George Lewis and Vijay Iyer and Robert O'Meally
Yeah,
and Sarah Jasmine Griffin fit into this kind of an argument because we know in the new jazz studies, Albert Murray, we
right.
know how crucial improvisation is, not just to jazz studies, but as an ethos of Black life, that we understand, Black musicking to be, fundamentally about playing through the changes because our conditions are shot through with precarity, right? That jazz is a praxis for Black living under the right now,
Uh-huh.
and
Oh,
and so, how do we sort of understand the standard within the context of these long, critical studies about improvisation in the context of Black studies?
yeah. I mean, I think that generally speaking, the ethos of my book and the argument that I'm making is totally congruent with that work, right? The new jazz studies, um, I mean, I started to encounter that as very end of my undergraduate days, the beginning of my graduate days, after I'm thinking of the late 90s and early 2000s, same time that I was working as a jazz musician.
Right. And then also playing with VJ.
Yeah, VJ and I go way, we were both at UC Berkeley.
Studying everything, the
So,
whole thing.
so
Cal there's great. Yeah. Hmm.
So I mean, and I remember when I was much younger, I used to be so aggravated with like the jazz autobiography because it was like all you could get, right? Or the jazz biography. And now I know how to read them. I appreciate them a lot more,
I mean, even Sidney Bechet. I mean, come on,
I
bro.
mean, but at the time, like I really wanted a kind of like critical studies of jazz, right? I was
Right.
dying for that because I was like a philosophy and music, undergrad, right? I
Oh,
was
you are? Yeah. Uh-huh.
so when I first encountered like the new jazz studies, Crin Gabbard's collections and the stuff that
Yeah.
had been coming out of Columbia, that was kind of groundbreaking for me.
Yes. Yes.
It's like
Yes.
finally. So
Yeah.
so my arguments are really congruent, I think, with those folks. I think one of the differences is that I am trying to kind of build up an account piece
Mhm.
by piece
Yes.
of how standards work in a way.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so I think that people would agree with the conclusions that I make, that my conclusions are not necessarily radical in that dimension. But I felt like there was value in actually trying to build it up piece by piece. How do you get from substituting a chord or altering a melody line or improvising to this emergent thing that
Yeah.
is a standard that is kind of constituted through its sociality and its historicity, so to speak. So that for me was important. One
Mhm.
place though where I think there's a kind of small difference that I would mention, which is that I don't think one of the arguments that's kind of hidden in this book, I don't know if it's hidden, but it hasn't been talked about much, is that I actually am kind of going after the centrality of improvisation a little bit in this book.
Huh.
Um, in the sense that I think that there's been too much that's been said about the difference between arrangement and improvisation. I think that
Yeah.
arrangement is deeply, deeply crucial to understanding the history of jazz, especially if you want to understand the history of jazz in long scope, right? I think
Yes.
improvisation, of course, is absolutely important, but there is a
Yes.
kind of like, I would say, a sort of bebopification of the history of jazz, right? You know what I mean? Like after bebop, there's a kind of rewriting and re-understanding of what is central to the jazz tradition. And I think that arrangement is really, really crucial. And the way that I try to think about that is I'm really interested in what I call replication in this book.
Mhm.
Replication for me is an operation where it's about making substitutes for one another, essentially. Like if something is substitutable for something else, that's a replication. And that operation, it happens within a social context. So for me, like if you play D minor 7 or D7 at the beginning of this tune and nobody cares in the jazz world, that's a replication, right? It's a socially sanctioned substitute. And I kind of think about replication as a musical operation that underlies both arrangement and improvisation. Because I want to be able to think not only about the brilliant arranging that Fletcher Henderson and Horace Henderson and Duke Ellington and all these folks are doing in the 1920s and 30s, which is crucial to understand the swing era. You've got to think about, arrangement. I think I try to kind of split the difference between arrangement and improvisation and figure out a way to think of them as sort of different in degree but not in kind. So that's one place where I think some of my orientation kind of goes against the way that improvisation has become so central, right, as a kind of concept within
Mhm.
the new jazz studies.
Mhm. You also talk about nomination. You want to maybe say a little bit
Yeah,
about what it is?
yeah. So the first part of the book's got these two operations that I think about, replication and nomination. They kind of are parallel one another. Replication is the making of kind of one piece of music on another, right? It's the making of one substitute after another. So when I keep reperforming these tunes, I'm
Mhm.
replicating them. Nomination is about like giving this tune a name.
Mhm.
And it's a way of bounding a network, I think, because if why did I need it? If I only follow replication, then like every time I have a 2-5-1 or every time I play a rhythm changes, it might all just be the same tune or something like that. I need nomination to kind of hold to be a countervailing force. And when I think about the relationship between replication and nomination or naming, it allows me to in the book to try to make some to describe, what a contrafact is, or like, and by contrafact, sorry, is a musicological term to talk about a real common phenomenon in jazz, right? Um, when Charlie Parker writes Donna Lee, right,
Mhm.
writes a new melody over the tune Back Home in Indiana, that's a contrafact, right? That's what we call that in musicological terms. Contrafacts are interesting because they're replications that have different nominations, right? Like it's Back Home in Indiana, but it's given a different name. And there's also situations where sometimes you get things that are musically very dissimilar, but they are given the same name. So when
Mhm.
Ornette Coleman plays Embraceable You and throws out all the chord changes, right? He's sort of making a claim about this thing that he's putting forth. He's saying, this is Embraceable You. It may not have the qualities that you expect it to have, but this is Embraceable You nevertheless. And so I need replication and nomination to kind of work together to help situate and kind of establish the networks that I use then as the basis for thinking about standards.
Mhm.
Sorry, that's a
Um,
little really technical and abstract, but
we love the wonk in you, Brian
okay.
Kane. Um, can we talk a little bit about vocalists and other kinds of instrumentalists in this book?
Yeah.
Now, how do they figure into the ways that you are thinking about the standard and the engagement with the standard? Should
Yeah.
they be all one of a piece, or, is there a distinction you would make between someone like our friend Cecile McLaurin-Salvant's work, just saw her at Carnegie Hall
Mhm.
on Saturday night in the
Oh, you
front?
did.
Yeah, I know, I forgot to tell you this. I yelled out Wuthering Heights and she effing did it during the.
Oh,
Yeah, I know. I wrote to her afterwards in the subject line, Wuthering Heights, oh my God, great. But she actually did it, which was great.
yeah.
Everything was great. But
Yeah.
somebody like a Cecile, versus, let's go with Charlie Parker, since he's
Mhm.
also on the cover of your book, which I want to talk about. But
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, everybody's got. I think when I zoom out, I want to I want to think about Charlie Parker and Cecil McLaurin Salvant as being capable of doing the same kinds of things to the standard. I don't think that I would want to um separate out vocalists from instrumentalists, you know, a priori, so to speak, like ahead of time. I think that the musical properties that they have access to and can work with are different, you know. Um, but generally, you know, they can do the same kind of radical work. They can do the same kind of revisionary work. They can push and alter and shape these tunes. They can comment on the histories of these things. Um, I mean, I think like thinking about like Cecile McLaurin Salvant, I think that one of the things that's she's such an amazing her knowledge of the repertory is so amazing, right? And she finds all kinds of things in the repertory that have not really been always well excavated, right? Like I think about like the Murder Ballad, which is her incredible performance of that, um, but I mean, some ways to talk about her, I got to kind of get into some of this stuff later on in the book where I'm thinking about like oral images and
yes.
so maybe I should introduce this concept to try to be able to. Okay, so
Yeah, yeah.
I have a concept later in the book that I try to introduce at the end of the book. I shared this chapter, so some people are probably familiar with this, called hearing double, right? And hearing double for me is a kind of mode of listening where when you're listening to standards and covers and all these kinds of places of musical reperformance, you have a kind of aural image in your head of what's happened before. With cover, I try to draw a distinction between cover songs and standards because I think that there's an important difference. Like with cover songs, I think that we tend to think about there being a kind of fixed aural image. Like when I hear Joe Cocker do with a little help from my friends, I can hear the Beatles version behind that, right? And I can use that, I can compare the difference between those two in order to understand what he's doing with that, with what Joe Cocker's doing, right? With standards, we don't always have the same fixed aural image, right? Because they've been performed so much. So so like when Cecile, so there are certain performances of hers that have a kind of cover-like aspect of that. Like I remember we heard her sing Pinky,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Like, and that's like there's that Sarah Vaughan recording of it, and there's very few other recordings of it. In some ways, it was like it's kind of a cover, right? I sometimes think of like performances of Strange Fruit as being like covers because the Billie Holiday performance, right? Her
Yes.
many performances are all kind of iconic, right?
Yes. David
Um,
Sedaris doing
yeah,
strange.
but there's other ones like, and when Cecile's doing Ida Cox, like Wild Women Don't Have the Blues, that's also
Yeah.
one that's kind of particularly associated with Ida Cox for me,
Yes.
right? But there
Yes.
are other things where she's singing like I didn't know what time it was, or something like that, where I don't know I don't have a particular fixed kind of aural image in my head. There's so many versions of that. She could be alluding to Charlie Parker. She could be alluding, like there's all kinds of things that are happening there. And that starts to kind of make it's a different relation, with the past, right? It's one where she's sort of inserting herself into a whole set of other performances, right? And negotiating with them in order to kind of do something that might be, whatever she's going to be doing with.
Network. She's
Yeah.
navigating the network.
Yeah. So I think like it's interesting with singers like like especially with her, because I think that because sometimes she picks repertory that hasn't been super well developed, right? There's a cover-like aspect where you can hear her kind of doing acts of reclamation or reinterpretation or taking or moving things from the past into the present in order to do a certain kind of political work or a kind of
Yeah.
commentary. But there's also moments where she's just simply negotiating with not only the repertory as a kind of big network, but also negotiating with the singers who sang it, right? Because you
Yeah.
hear in her work in particular, right? There's moments where she's like evoking Betty Carter and moments where she's evoking Sarah Vaughan and moments where she's evoking Bessie Smith. And you hear her doing all of that stuff in her
Yes.
voice. There's a kind of
That's
there's
it.
a kind of, historical
Right.
capture in a certain way, right? That she's like, or
Right.
that she's doing. And that's, I think,
Creation of the citational, right? Yeah. Okay.
and
So,
instrumentalists do that too, right? Like I have a bit at the end of the book where I talk about Joe Henderson playing Bobby,
yes,
and he's a person for me in his particular performance I talk about where he's just recapitulating the kind of history of the song, um,
yes,
picking on its different moments. And so that's something that I think these amazing jazz musicians are kind of able to do. They're able to be totally themselves and unique and do these new performances that
yeah,
are also completely rooted, like their citational richness is like off the charts, you know?
yes, yes. Well, this is making me think again about, arrangement and about, say, Peter Zendi's really famous and
Mhm.
influential meditations on arrangement as a form of listening. And I'm wondering how you think about that and about listening versus hearing, which is
Mm.
captured in your title,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
that works itself out in the book.
Oh, yeah. I love Zedi's book. I think referring to Listen, History of Our Ears, I think that's a fantastic, fantastic book.
I do too.
Um, and I love the idea that that an arrangement is a kind of transcription of a listening. That's been a very influential book on me. Um, and I do think hearing double in a way is like that, right? That you can hear that in listening to somebody's performance of a standard, you can also hear the way they are hearing. I
Yes.
didn't I didn't like hard pedal it so much in the book um because I was trying to in some ways um how do I put it? It's a little, I think Zendi's got a slightly easier time making the argument because he can do something like look at, say, Franz Liszt's transcriptions of Beethoven symphonies, right? And really go like do the kind of comparison. So I think the materials, the archive that he's working with allow him to make that argument in a certain kind of way that's a little bit more challenging. But I am totally inspired by his thinking on this. Um, I think that, I mean, maybe I should have called it listening double because I mean, think sometimes we think about the difference between hearing and listening. Is that sometimes hearing seems like the passive one or the kind of biologically driven one, and listening is the cultural one or something like that. I believe Jonathan Stern's arguments that we only constitute hearing on the basis of listening, meaning that like we kind of make up ideas about how hearing works based
Yeah.
on our modern forms of listening. I buy that argument. So in some ways, I guess I should have called the book Listening Double if I really wanted to be, precise, but hearing double sounds better. To play on those seeing double or any of these kinds of sensory mixes. But I do think of it as a kind of active, it's an informed, knowledgeable, expert kind of thing, right? People who are really deep in the jazz world, which is always jazz musicians, right? I mean, they're the most intense listeners, all this stuff they're kind of expert listeners, they're really engaged in the history of the repertory that's come before. And so I love that kind of expertise. I love that listeners can also bring that kind of expertise, and that part of becoming like getting involved in like the world of jazz is learning how to hear all that repertory.
Yes. I mean, this is the unsternification of a comment.
Mhm.
Love Jonathan Stern, but I feel just kind of organically like there's something about hearing double that applies or suggests something resonant that you're not just um making a calculated sort of engagement with the sound, but you are picking up all of
Mm.
these different kinds of frequencies, right? And I'm mixing, I'm using all sorts of metaphors and shit
Oh,
here.
yeah. Interesting.
So I don't know, it feels expansive. So I'm just like thumbs up to the title.
Right.
Um, I'm mindful of time because there are a lot of questions that are coming into the chat that we want to get to. And I
Yeah.
think I'm going to get assistance with the questions, or am I going to pull them myself? We'll find that out later. But I have a question for you. I mentioned style. I also mentioned the cover. I want to get to that. But I want
Yeah.
to go back to a line that's from the introduction, and you read it about the palpability of the standard. And you
Mhm.
actually do kind of riff on that in the moment when you make that, formulation. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more about how we can kind of think about the palpability of the standard
Yeah.
in sound studies and in our quotidian lives and
Mhm.
that jazz.
Yeah. I think starting from there's a couple of different um layers to the question of palpability here. I mean, on the first layer would be something like its engagement with philosophers of music who have thought about musical works in particular ways, right? So what I want I would so one sense of palpability for me is that a musical work is not like some abstract thing. It's not an abstract structure. It's not a platonic idea. It's not any of that. It is really like it has palpability because like you're as a musician, in some sense, your life is on the line when you have to play these things, right? So it has stakes and that, so if somebody calls a tune and you don't know it, like you got to deal with that. And they're not just calling some abstract thing. They're saying there's like a set of protocols and rules and negotiable rules, but rules nevertheless, right, that are there to deal with. So for me, that's one dimension of its palpability. Um, the I guess other dimensions of the palpability of the standard is that they are like places where if they are truly places where there's a kind of sedimentation of historical
Yeah.
being and sociality, right? Then they're also like they are places where they are archives, right? Where
Yeah.
we look at these, we can kind of work with them in a kind of
Yeah.
material way to try to uncover things from the past and to understand, you know, to try to understand, you know, the socialities and consciousnesses and actions of the past, right? They're all there. There's also a kind of way in which they embody not only kind of like previous intentionalities, but also the kind of broader stuff, that is like always happening in art, right? Beyond just the artist's intention, like there's always the kind of the broader social dimensions that are always being brought in. So that's, I think, part of their palpability is like they offer a way to think historically and socially in music that isn't that is, and because they are corrigible, because they're malleable and they change over time, they offer a kind of rich way to do that, in a way that like that sometimes if we only think about, say, the reception of musical works, what are the various ways in which Beethoven 5 has been understood over time? We're not, it's like those are all just about reception, but there's something about the standard that I haven't quite, I don't quite know to have the words for it, but there's something about it and its form of being, the way that it emerges from all these performances and the way that everybody has to negotiate with them, that functions as a kind of amazing repository and archive of experience and decision and politics and, like a repository of everything in some ways. So I think that's part of what I mean by its palpability.
Listen, man, you want my Black feminist answer to that?
Yeah.
It really, for me, conjures notions of Morrison's rememory from Beloved. And, for instance, if I think about Nina's town hall version of Summertime, um, the palpable affective dimensions of that performance are enabling me to hear double, to hear not just Summertime in the context of the opera Porgy and Bess, but also the entire conditions in which the song is sung in the opera and
Hmm.
reimagined and riffed on and broken open by
Right.
Nina. And, Morrison in Beloved gives us this very rich and complicated way of thinking about intersecting temporalities that manifests itself through trauma, right? And are
Hmm.
conjured, and reconjured through the trauma of, the memories of violence and subjugation in relation to Black life in the context of Beloved. But it is this kind of, intersecting temporalities and spatialities that create a moment that is larger than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
And so I sort of, when you said that about the palpability of the standard, it really it helped me to think about the affective dimensions of this work that you're doing
Mhm.
with repertory.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked, I mean, the people here probably know that you're working on Summertime and Porgy and Bess, right?
It's been happening for a long, long time, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is, it's, I mean, the conversation that we've had about that. I mean, this, definitely shaped this final chapter on Hearing Double, right? Talking with you about what you were doing with that material. Because, I mean, I know that like when we first met and first started to kind of work together around the Black Sound, the Archive Working Group,
Like,
I had,
that's not
there
what
was,
I'm doing. That's what you
well, I
said to
mean,
me.
yeah, I know.
You know?
I
You
grew. I
to
grew.
play
I
with
know. But I really only had the first half of this thing together. I had the philosophical stuff together, and I had this bunch of intuitions about what I wanted to do in the second half and how I wanted to push it. But of course, it really was shaped very much in dialogue with you and with the work that we were doing in the Black Sound the Archive Working Group. That's why I gave you such a big shout out in the introduction to the book,
I mean, thanks, man. Vice versa. It's all about the conversation and being able to collaborate and grow. So let's actually do a couple quick things here. I mean, not quick, but this cover I love so much. I hope people can see it okay. Why this cover? What is it? Why this cover for the story that you're telling in this book? And then maybe we'll round out with just style and voice and how you approached writing this book. Open the floor to questions.
Yeah. I mean, book covers are a challenge, right? To try to figure out uh,
Covers. Yeah.
covers are a challenge.
Yeah.
Uh, I love this image because I love being able to look at Red Rodney's face and Charlie Parker's face, right, in this moment of listening, right? I mean, they clearly have the kind of comportment of listeners, right? They're listening, and here in the background you can also see reflected in the mirror behind them Dizzy Gillespie is playing trumpet with Chuck Wayne's on bass and Margie Hines, I think, is on piano or something. It's a William Gottlieb photo that's from the Library of Congress, beautiful Gottlieb photo. But I love I love the way that it captures Parker's expression, right, as a listener, but it also is able to kind of you can see you can see who he's listening to. You can't quite know what he's hearing in it, but you know that he's hearing something that's going on. So I like the image as a kind of the metaphor of the mirror was good for a kind of sense of doubling and the way that Parker and Red Ronnie's expression was thematizing hearing, I thought was useful. It's just an amazing image. I mean,
Yeah.
once I saw it, I was like, that's the book cover right
It's
there.
great. It's one of my favorite covers of all time, man. So, kudos to you. So
Well,
let's talk about the Brian Kane voice, known across the academy and in the field of music and philosophy as a head buster, somebody who will crack open those theoretical paradigms and go deep into the Western canon of philosophy and extrapolate its meaning with rigor and intensity. Really, I'm not signifying on you right now. It is always well, masterclass would be a signifying moment. So it is always an invigorating challenge to read your work, Brian Kane. And this book opens with the beautiful passage that you've given us, and I just think it reorients, how a reader navigates the book as a whole, which is not to say that all of that other Brian Kane isn't there, but you
mhm.
are kind of framing it in a different way. And I'm interested in your decision for doing that and, what else you would want to say perhaps about voice, since
Yeah,
that's maybe a bridge to your next project as well.
yeah. Um, part of the decision, yeah, it's different from the way that from other writing that I've done. It's different from Sound Unseen. The tone is definitely different. The voice is different. Um, there's one reason is it's nice to write a book after tenure and to feel a little like I feel like first books are often paranoid books and they're doing defensive work sometimes, in the footnotes, especially at a place like Yale when you're trying to get tenure, like so um so I felt like this book was less defensive, could be less paranoid, and that was nice to be able to write like that. I mean, that's part of it. But the other thing is that I, for some reason, I always thought of this book as an essay,
Yeah.
like that it was just kind of like it's a long essay.
Mhm.
And I wanted to be able to sort of position, to give the reader a sense of like where that there's going to be some rough going at the beginning as we slog through a lot of analytic philosophy and Alan Fort and all this stuff, but that there will be a payoff at the end. And and that I also was thinking about the book as having a kind of um that the temporality of the book was like kind of in smaller segments, right? It's broken up by a lot of, I don't know, what do you call that thing? We do the three dot thing, between paragraphs. There's probably some specific term for that, but it's like, it's very like, it's phrase like. I thought about like the,
Yeah.
the way in which kind of phrases pile up one after another, like in the jazz solo. I was thinking about that, in the book. I didn't want it to make it like too on the nose because it's not like, I'm not like flowing, man. And like, it's not all that stuff, right? It's still me being, nerdy and analytic and stuff like that and trying to be really precise. But there were, I don't know, I always thought of it as like this big long essay. It seemed to me like it had a kind of one continuous kind of argument that I was trying to, lay out over time. And so I think that helped me think about the voice differently, that I could be a little bit more first person at times.
Mhm.
I never thought about Sound Unseen as an essay. That was like a book.
Right. Right. I mean, you know, I feel like you are telling a story in this book. We always are telling stories in our critical work, but that um, the narrative ambition of this book is also tied to its ethics.
Hmm.
That's what I want to say.
Say more about that. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, the fact that you center yourself and you give us a kind of micro narrative at the beginning about your own pedagogy
Mhm.
in relation to standards and repertory um, is 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 part of the argument that you're making, and that therefore the structure of the narrative is tied to the core beliefs that you are mobilizing
Yeah, yeah,
in the text, you
yeah,
know?
yeah. I
Um,
mean, in some ways, I wanted to kind of like I wanted to to pay respect to the jazz musicians who taught me when I was much younger, but also to give them a sense of what I had learned. And I was trying to turn that knowledge into a kind of thesis, right? And so I
yeah.
guess that's why I thought about it as an essay. Like I was putting forth the kind of argument at the beginning, which is to say musical ontology is historical and social, right? And the jazz standard is like a totally amazing place to think about that. And in some ways, I mean, that's one of the lessons that I learned. And I think I wanted the reader to keep in mind after they read the introduction that even when the book gets abstract and I'm working through various case studies and every chapter has music in it, right? Every chapter's got elaborate case studies. I wanted the music to be really front and center. I want people to stop reading and listen to the recordings, like and do all that work. But I also wanted, as abstract as it'll get at certain moments, to be really rooted in a very basic kind of human experience of like learning from others, being part of a community, learning about seeing how history was being embodied and lived. So that was one of the reasons why I put the personal sort of first person stuff at the beginning of the book.
And to bring it full circle, that's why I found it so comforting to read right now. I want to believe that we can learn from our communities, and make things that are beautiful and meaningful to each other. I still want to believe that, even though, the world is telling us otherwise.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it's been a long time since I've been a jazz musician, and a long time, and I don't really know what the communities are like, in places in New Haven and New York and the places, around me now. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, Oakland and San Francisco was such an incredible place to be a musician, and the community there was so wonderful and generous, and I had such an amazing time. That was such a great time of my life to play music, to read books all day before being in grad school, like. And it's a lifestyle that like it can't exist anymore. Economically, there aren't the gigs. The rent is too high. Like all of the stuff that made that possible, right, is gone. I'm very, very grateful, very, very grateful to have been alive at that time, to be able to do that and to be like, and to have learned from a generation of musicians who were there in the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, what I learned from Frank is totally invaluable. I wish I had asked him more questions. He passed away probably a decade ago. I wish I had asked him more questions. I wish that I had been more curious at the time. But if anyone's really interested, I mean, Frank Jackson's a really amazing person. He was an amazing musician. And if anyone wants to kind of dig a little bit deeper into him, there's a really incredible book called Harlem of the West. It's about the Fillmore Jazz District, and it's mostly oral histories and photos. And instead of it doing like person by person, they go club by club, right? So it's organized in a really interesting way. So like they'll focus on each club, and then they have people talking about it. Frank is probably the central interlocutor in that book. He's all through it because he was like just the living history of the Fillmore District. It was such an incredible, and with also just a totally amazing memory for music, but details, people, everything. So I feel like in some ways that book, I can hear his voice in it. It's a fantastic book. I mean, it's a very moving book for me to read because it's just like I remember Frank talking about all of these things. So anyway, I'm rambling, but I do love the community was incredible at that time, and it really did shape me. And I'm very, very grateful to have been able to hang out in it for a while.
That's great, Brian. Thank you so much. And
Thank,
congratulations.
thank you, Brian and Daphne, for that fantastically rich conversation. And I'm so looking forward to reading the book, Brian. We have some questions in the chat. The first one is from somebody. It's SC Services is what I'm seeing. I think maybe we'll ask you to just ask your first question and then see if there's time to come back to the second one.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm working with a loaner laptop, my regular laptop. So my name is Dana Poland, but it's the department's name that came up on it. So I really like the book, and I wanted to congratulate you on it. And I started with two apologies. I'm not a musicologist. I'm a cinema studies professor, and also I haven't gone all the way through. So you may talk about this later. I was interested when you talk about retroaction in the book, and it tends to be a later version influencing our experience of the earlier version. But I want to ask you about cases where we might only know the later version, and we hear an interpretation of a standard that we've never heard the original. And I'm
Yeah.
I'm sort of very interested in Adorno, and you cite Turn of Music. And if we bracket out all, it's hard to do, but if we bracket out all his criticisms, I think he's onto something, which is the ontology of different media, and the ontology of when we hear a song in a particular medium can influence in a way how we're going to hear it elsewhere. I mean, in his case, I think he would use the word damage. So he would say, for example, I think if you first heard something on radio, that will damage your ability to hear the earlier version. I just wanted your thoughts on retroaction, because, in the book, and I think it's great, you have arrows that go from earlier to later. But what if the arrow is only from later to earlier?
Right. Yeah. I'm so just a quick note on Adorno. I mean, I'm somebody who's totally willing to bracket out Adorno's, I think, probably misinformed judgments about most of the jazz repertoire and still be interested in the insights that he has about music, right? And current music, I think, is kind of brilliant, in lots of ways. Yeah, retroaction. So I critique retroaction early in the book because I think it's the move that the musical ontologists do, right? They have a bunch of you could always listen to the latest version and go back and find all the essential properties, right? There's a kind of sleight of hand that I talked about. But there is another kind of retroaction that would be the retroaction that would happen. That could be about the kind of chronological disruption that just happens because people encounter things in whatever order they encounter it, right? And that ends up, so the later things being ones.
I don't know, like your example, if you heard Joe Cocker before hearing the Beatles,
right?
I mean, would that always change the Beatles version?
Yeah, it might, it might. And that would be interesting. I mean, I don't really talk about the case where one would be expected to say hear double, but doesn't know the original, let's say, and there's lots of cases where, I mean, I do talk about moments where there seems to be later versions that kind of eclipse earlier versions. Like the whole case study I do on In the Mood, in a way, at the beginning is that. But I think there could be one could write about that phenomenon of retroaction and what it would mean to sort of discover after the fact the kind of that intense feeling that something is historical in a certain way, that the Joe Cocker version is based on something else. Or, I mean, there's lots of cases with the jazz tradition where I didn't know, I didn't know the earlier versions of tunes until I, became older and had to start teaching jazz history and things like that. It does shape our experience of it in lots of ways. There could be, I imagine, that would be an interesting thing to explore.
Next question is from Franklin Bruno.
Hi. So having just read the 2 chapters, I think I knew the older paper already, the Body and Soul paper, but the chapter you gave, you have a comment early on that the status or even the value of something, a particular titled piece, whatever we want to say, as a standard, doesn't depend on positively or negatively on the it being the aesthetic quality of the song per se, right? Like in a way that an Alec Wilder would want you to look at, right? Okay. Great. I want to know where in your framework the occasional jazz piece that tends to be played with where the tradition itself is to play it with relatively little improvisation. I'm thinking particularly of Lush Life, which obviously it's interpreted, but it's not a blowing tune. People don't generally play multiple choruses of it. It's very unusual in that the verse is almost always played along with the chorus. Obviously, I'm sure there are outliers. I'm sure there are arrangements. And I was also thinking of Crepuscule with Nellie, which I think at least Monk only plays one chorus. They're almost like, those are almost like through composed art songs, and they're allowed to be. And I'm wondering what that signifies within. I'm not so much presenting them as counterexamples, as what does that say about their status as in a jazz context? Are those ways? I'm thinking maybe they're ways of like not messing with them too much is a way of paying tribute to them. And so the larger question that opens that I'm interested in as also a practitioner is there any room for creative agency for songwriters or composers as such, or only for interpreters and arrangers? Do I get to be an artist too, or only the people who play the stuff?
That's a great question. I mean, no, I think those are great examples. There are clearly moments. I mean, those are tunes that are so much about their composers, right? I mean, everybody plays Lush Life knowing it's a Billy Strayhorn tune, right? And as we know more and more about Billy Strayhorn, that tune seems to take on accrue more and more meaning all the time. So, I don't think that I'm not saying that composers don't get their due and it's all about performers, but I don't think that they really get to control much. I mean, maybe Lush Life is such an amazing tune and so beautiful and so complicated that people and presented in a certain way that it ends up being,
it's hard to run. To run changes. I've heard people say this about certain other. I'm not sure I know, but that Sophisticated Lady is kind of a hard tune to do much with as an improviser because the marriage between the chords and the melody is so tight. So
but Harry Carney does play some amazing chords, right? So I don't know, I think it's really tune by tune in certain way. I mean, it's interesting that that what I'm not trying to I am trying to come up with to have a theory that could sort of like talk about all of those different examples, right? So it's not like the performers are the only ones that own the scene,
Mhm.
but there might be certain tunes that's like that becomes the kind of the rule of the game about how you play them, they get presented in certain ways and they go on and and that would be interesting to think about why those particular tunes function the way they do, how they are attached to particular composers or when they are
Yeah.
introduced. I mean, there might be all kinds of things that one could think about with those examples, as opposed to like the tunes where nobody really like who wrote Invitation, you know, like,
Right.
like, I mean, nobody talks about that or so, there's other situations where these tunes they emerge out of a kind of, your hit parade context, right? And
Yeah.
they're,
Yeah.
so
Well, there's the Mac. Do you have? There's the Max. Last thing I'll say. There's the Max Roach comment somewhere that certain songs only became well known because some cat played the shit out of them, right? And the tune would be forgotten. I I see that, but I don't think it's true for all of the. I mean, there've got to be some of the tunes that people aren't playing because they hate them,
right.
right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. The question of aesthetic value for me, I was just trying to sort of displace the question about aesthetics away from
Yeah.
immanent property of the musical works itself. So it
Yeah. Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
standards are great because they are great compositions.
Right. Right.
We know that's not always the case.
Right.
I was really interested in thinking about the kind of aesthetics of hearing double, like what it meant, what kind of comparative thing people were doing, despite the kind of quote quality of the original tunes. So I'm not, I would say some standards are amazingly well composed, and some other ones are
Yeah.
not that interesting, right? But given that variability, in all cases, I think that the question of hearing double is present, right? And so that's sort of why I was shifting things in that direction at the end of the book.
Okay. Thanks.
Great question, though.
Really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from David Sussman.
Hi, thank you for a great conversation. I'm really excited about the book and thinking about musical ontology in terms of the sociality and historicity, I think is really rich, and I'm looking forward to digging in further. But my question is this: during the conversation, I found myself thinking a couple of times about irony, and I was wondering about how or maybe when irony is important to replication. And there's something very different going on, I think, or
Yeah.
is there something different going on when you have this kind of sincere tribute to the original or an earlier version versus, Nina Simone doing Summertime? There's a
Right.
different thing going on. So that's
Yeah.
that's what I was wondering about.
Thanks for your question. Learned a lot. Sorry, I just got to say I learned a lot about the pop music industry and early Tin Pan Alley from reading your work early on. So thanks so much for all that.
Thank you.
So replication, I don't think of it as being tied to something like sincerity per se. I really try to define it as broadly as possible as as like, how would I put it, the substitution of one artifact for another in a given social context or something like that. Like it's very like it just needs people to say this is an adequate substitute for that in some ways, right? At the very basic level. I'm very interested in places where irony would show up in replication. I don't really talk much about it in the book, but I think it's absolutely crucial. I mean, this is like whether it's irony or critique or what, I mean, Daphne's work on Summertime is all about this, right? And we've listened to a lot of recordings of Summertime together that are so amazing in the way that they do this. I mean, Nina Simone's would be one, but there's an incredible live Ella Fitzgerald version of Summertime that blows my mind, where she sings it basically totally straight. We don't always think of Ella Fitzgerald as being somebody with a kind of biting critique. And or at least I don't, but I probably should, because halfway through it, after she sings it, then she talks and she's just like, why is the cotton always high? Why is it always the mom's always good looking? Like, and it's just an unbelievable sort of like fantastic critique of this song. So I think that within the space of replication, as I tried to imagine it, is broad enough to be able to handle both sincere homage and absolutely critical takedown, right? I was trying to at least come up with a concept that would be broad enough to do that.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Alex, VC.
Hi, thanks, Brian. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the interpretive work when instrumentalists take a song with lyrics and turn it into an instrumental. I'm thinking
Yeah.
in particular in the comments, I mentioned, I was thinking a lot about like kind of the comparison point between like the Jackson Coltrane version of The Night We Called It a Day and the Carmen McRae version, which I prefer because I like Carmen's weariness
Mhm.
and I like the sentiment of the song in her voice. And so I'm just sort of curious what happens when instrumentalists don't have like language in the kind of conventional sense to work with when they're interpreting songs.
Yeah. I mean, different. I'm not sure how I could. I mean, how do I answer that? It's a good question. Language, has language does different things than instrumental sound does. And it's not as if there's plenty of, banal versions of The Night We Called It a Day, right? As well, right? So I don't know. I'm not quite sure how to think about the what happens when instrumentalists are sort of, how they relate to lyrics of songs. I mean, I think it's very individual, right? I mean, some instrumentalists seem very attentive to the questions that like they know the lyrics of the songs, right? I mean, isn't this Lester Young's advice or something like that? And Dexter Gordon always talks about that too. So there's certain instrumentalists that seem to like be really attentive about that. I knew musicians in Oakland who were always like, you need to know you got to know what the songs are about if you ever want to play them right. So I don't know. It's hard to generalize about it. But but singers do, I mean, because of their capacity to work with language and to shape and to do all the other things that the voice can do, shape vowels and play with phrasing and do all that. They have a whole other set of resources for shaping meaning in songs. And, the Carmen McRae's of the world are brilliant at it. So, but I'm not sure how else to respond to the question in a way.
Well, one thing that came up in the chat that maybe you could speak to in relation to this question is there's a conversation that's happening about my favorite things, which I actually do prefer like the instrumental versions of that song to the
Oh
version of
yeah.
the Sound of Music. So,
Yeah.
and obviously that's kind of been taken up as a jazz standard, even though it comes
Right.
from like, the Broadway tradition.
Yeah. Okay. So that's it. So my favorite things is one of the songs that I feel like has very little compositional quality. Like I kind of hate my favorite thing, but Coltrane's version is amazing, right? And it's amazing because of its radicality in relationship to the original. It is very conscious about the distance, with which it is working with the original. Even though, like, I understand he got it from a song plugger, right? Like when Sound of Music was on Broadway and the song pluggers were like pushing the sheet music. That's like supposedly when he got it. I mean, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I remember reading that's in some Coltrane book. Um, I think when jazz musicians do kind of radical versions of these tunes, when they like will shoot through my favorite things and just turn it into a kind of modal composition, I mean, that's fantastic. That's one of the amazing things that jazz can do because jazz is so permissive in its forms of replication, right? It doesn't need it doesn't care about its fidelity to a kind of original. So I think those things like that are amazing. Coltrane's version of, my favorite things and Chim Chim Cheree and Inchworm and or Cecil Taylor's version of This Nearly Was Mine, you know, which I think Mary Baraka referred to once as a dyspeptic nightmare, right? I agree with that.
Thank you.
Dana Pullen, do you want to ask your second question? I think you're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
And it sort of followed from what I was asking before. And again, because I'm a cinema scholar coming to music from outside, I wanted to ask you about the ontology, not of songs and of versions, but the ontology of media.
Okay.
And again, Adorno would argue, there's something irreducible about hearing something on radio compared to hearing it in a concert hall. So,
Sure.
And you at one point talk about the example of a professor who might come into a class with an LP or a CD, and each of those could lead to the same listening experience. But I guess I want to ask you more thoughts on the extent to which the ontology of media impact the ontology of songs.
Yeah.
Because much of what you're talking about is, it's a song, another version of the song in a concert, in a club, on an album. But does it change also, even if the lyrics are the same, even if the melody is the same, does the ontology of the medium change it?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a long, I try to address this in the very long chapter in this book on the soundscape of standards,
Okay.
which is the chapter that I didn't share because it's long. But in that chapter, so this is actually, I think, this was a very important motivation for me to write the book. One of the things that I wanted to try to do in the book is to try to link together notions of ontology and notions of auditory culture. This has been a hobby horse of mine for a long time. And I have a whole article in that came out in the inaugural issue of Sound Studies where I'm grumpy about the way that sound studies is somehow being separated away from auditory culture, right? So part of what I was trying to do in this book was think about the two of them in relation. So the first half of the book is very much a philosophical account that's going to lay out here's a bit by bit way to think about the ontology of the standard. The second half of the book shifts and says, what were the conditions, the historical conditions under which this ontology came into being, right? So I think about ontology as not the way that the world is, but the way that we need the world to be, right? So I don't think about ontology as fundamental. I don't think about it as first philosophy, as Aristotle did. I think about it as second philosophy or something like that, right? Praxis is first. So, okay, so to make this very concrete, in the second half of the book, I'm trying to make an argument that the conditions under which music circulated between, say, the years 1930 and 1960 were absolutely central to the formation of the standard. So there is a kind of media ontology that's at work here, right? And for me, what that story is something like, I really focused a lot on radio because what I got really interested, this blew my mind when I found out this fact. I didn't realize until I'd done a lot of work on radio that in the 1930s, right, the networks were not interested in phonography, right? That the idea that what we think about radio nowadays, we think about format radio, right? We think about like turning on the classic rock station, you're going to hear, whatever, Led Zeppelin and, like whatever you're going to hear, right? Those small playlists over and over and over again. That's not radio in the 1930s. The way that I sometimes describe this in radio in the 1930s is songs are being written, they're being published, they're being plugged. There's various plugs. They're happening by different performers all the time. So you can turn on the radio and if it's drive week, you're going to hear Long Ago and Far Away, sung at 8 o'clock by Xavier Cugat's orchestra, and 8:30 by Benny Goodman, and 9 o'clock by whoever, right? And that idea of hearing these songs in different arrangements in close sequence, one after another, is absolutely central to what the standard is, because the expectation would be that a song is not just going to be repeated over and over and saturate the soundscape, that a song is going to be heard in different versions, like again and again in close succession. That's crucial. So radio is part of that. But it's also radio. It's not just the ontology of radio, like as Adorno would say about how the sound destroys the immersive experience of that, which maybe if you're talking about a tube radio that's got hum and all that stuff, yeah, it's radio tied to an economic apparatus, right? That's pushing songs in a certain way, right? Radio could have been all about phonography in the 1920s and 1930s, but you had a government that was like, we don't need that, right? Radio needs to do something else. There's all of these reasons why this shaped up. The moral of the story, the way that I sometimes talk about this with my students is imagine this. And I think this makes it very palpable. Imagine okay, Beyonce drops her new record, right? Boom. And then this next week, 10 people are doing versions of that are the same song, but like different arrangements of it, right? All at once. And they're all competing on the charts at the same time, right? That is a totally different set of conditions on the ground for imagining what a song is than the idea that just like a record comes out and it gets played over and over and over and saturates our soundscape. So that to me is one of the very, very important ways that radio and media shape our understanding of the standard. And then what happens, then I can tell a story that's like the story that Alban Zach does in I Don't Sound Like Nobody, or that Ben Yagoda gives in the B-side, which is basically to say there is a shift that happens, right? Around 1950, the rise of the studio system, the rise of the new sound does start to shape this, the rise of the DJ. All of these things matter. in terms of changing how music is circulating, and thus our understanding of the ontology of music. But in that section, I make a few arguments that I think are different from the Ben Yagoda and Alban Zak arguments as well. So then there's a bunch of arguments in there that I think are I'm very proud of, that I'm like, yeah, trying to understand something, how sound's operating and how replication becomes duplication and what happens with free jazz and the way that the standard, Baraka wants to see Coltrane as murdering the standard. He's the assassin of the standard, like there's all these things that are starting to change that moment. So that's the big way that media comes into my story. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Yeah. Can I ask very quickly, because I absolutely agree with you, but in agreeing with you, I would drop the term ontology, and I wonder why you want to retain it.
Like about musical ontology?
Yeah. Why should we even be thinking about an ontology?
I'm using it in the sense that musical ontology is describing somehow what music is or something. I do think it's a useful term still. I think that musical ontology is been talking about musical works and performances for a long time. I'm willing to quite chuck it. I think it actually is designating something, a kind of region that can be analyzed and discussed. So I do find the term useful. Somebody was just pushing back on me a couple of days ago at the American Musicological Society thing about, oh yeah, we should get rid of the term ontology altogether. This guy was a super hardcore Derridian, who was like, ontology is always, ethnocentrism and blah, blah, blah. And I was like,
Yeah.
not so fast.
But I think it's because I'm a radical historicist and I want to think that there's no essence or essential object. It's always in historical context.
Yeah, I agree with it. I agree, but I think that ontologies emerge out of historical context. I'm like a Age of the World picture guy from Heidegger or something like that, where it's like history is what is shaping our ontologies. Ontologies don't become second, right? It's all praxis all the way down. And then this is how we justify the world. Or I'm Aquinian or something in that sense. Yeah. So I'm with you.
Okay.
I agree with you, but I still think there's value in holding on to the term. That was very nerdy.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Nerdy is a great way to conclude, I think. And it was so many things as well as nerdy. So thanks to both of you for this great session. Thanks everybody. Carl, I've forgotten who's coming next time, who's doing the next one. Do you want to announce?
Yeah, it's a Stephen Dusner and Stacey Easton talking about Garth Brooks and Dolly Parton.
Great, thanks. All right, good night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.